Coming up on Arirang News, President Moon Jae-in announces the creation of a national fund by the private and public sectors to support the Korean New Deal. It'll be worth roughly $17 billion, and he says it's a chance for ordinary investors too. The number of coronavirus cases continues to fall, fewer than 200 today, but a worrying number of critical cases among the elderly. And the South Korean company Kakao Games smashes the record for a local IPO. Ahead of its debut on the Kospi, over-the-counter shares were oversubscribed by a factor of more than 1,500. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The number of COVID-19 cases in Seoul and the surrounding area has been coming down in the past few days. There were fewer than 200 today, but many of the patients are elderly and are critically ill. Our Han has the latest.
South Korea reported 195 new COVID-19 cases on Thursday, the fifth day in a row that the daily tally has been under 300. It's also the first time in over 2 weeks that the number of new infections dropped below the 200 mark. Of the new cases, 188 were locally transmitted, with most of them concentrated in Seoul and the surrounding area. Despite the downward trend, however, health officials warn that now is not the time to ease restrictions.
Please don't forget that a moment's carelessness can stop our daily lives for a very long time.
Sporadic cluster infections are still popping up across the nation, including at a music academy, apartments, sports facilities, and volunteer groups. Those come on top of extra infections stemming from churches and the protests last month at Gwanghwamun Square in Seoul. The number of patients in serious condition also jumped by 31 in just a day to hit 154, the highest number since the nation reported its first COVID-19 case in late January. To make things worse, the proportion of new cases from unidentified transmission routes also reached the record high of 24.4% over the past 2 weeks. The government will decide over the weekend on whether it will extend its current level 2.5 social distancing measures beyond this coming Sunday, their original expiration date. 3 more deaths were reported Thursday, bringing the total count to 329. South Korea has conducted slightly more than 2 million diagnostic tests since January 3rd, and close to 21,000 people have tested positive so far. Han Sung-woo, Arirang News.
Wednesday night and early Thursday, Typhoon Maysak left a trail of destruction from Jeju Island to Seoul. 1 person died in Busan and hundreds of thousands of homes lost power. Choi Jung-yoon reports.
The 9th typhoon of the season, Typhoon Maysak, has left much of the Korean peninsula in a state of chaos. The typhoon caused 1 fatality and injured another in the southern port city of Busan, one of the hardest hit areas along with Jeju Island. The Central Disaster and Safety Countermeasure Headquarters on Thursday said a woman in her 60s died after being hit by fragments of glass from a shattered window. A total of 26 people who were forced to evacuate their homes in Gangwon-do province on Jeju Island and in other regions of the country are yet to return home. Meanwhile, from 8 cities and provinces, some 2,400 were evacuated temporarily as a precaution. The typhoon also caused power outages in over 270,000 households.
I prepared ice packs to keep things frozen, but I'm afraid this will end up going bad. We don't know when the power will come back on.
The typhoon uprooted a 230-year-old lace bark pine in Gyeonggi-do Icheon City, classified as Natural Monument 253. Some 860 cases of flooded roads and houses have been reported, as well as damage to streetlights, cars, and telephone poles. Damage to farmland amounted to some 5,000 hectares.
We can't calculate the total damage. We haven't restored anything. We have to throw away everything as all the crops will rot once the sun comes out.
In a time where recovery is vital, another typhoon is heading towards Korea. With its predicted strength and route, experts say Typhoon Hanshin could bring greater damage than Maysak has. Forecasts show that it will land on the southern coast of South Korea next Monday and make its way up through the peninsula heading north. If Hanshin makes landfall in South Korea as anticipated, it would break the record for the most typhoons to make landfall in a single season. Choi Jung-yoon, Arirang News.
This morning, President Moon Jae-in chaired the government's first strategy meeting on his administration's New Deal initiative. There, he introduced plans to create a special fund as well as multi-billion financing plan to support the New Deal projects, which he said will open a new future for the country's economy. Kim Min-ji reports.
President Moon Jae-in says the government will be creating a fund worth 20 trillion won, or roughly $17 billion to fund the New Deal projects. The fund will bring together investments from the government, state-run financial institutions, and private financial firms. Moon also encouraged active participation from the general public, citing stable profits and tax benefits.
개인의 수익 창출은 물론 국민들께서 직접 대한민국의 미래와 사회적 가치에 투자하는 기회가 될 것입니다.
President Moon added that over the next 5 years, $84 billion in policy loans and private finance worth $59 billion will be used to invest in New Deal projects. On top of that, the government also plans to create a so-called New Deal index to attract further investment. The New Deal initiative aims to meet the country's future needs and create jobs that embrace two main pillars, digital and green. President Moon introduced the idea a few months back as a means to prepare for the post-COVID-19 era.
한국판 뉴딜은 뉴딜 펀드와 뉴딜 금융으로 대한민국 경제의 미래를 열어나갈 것입니다. 정부의 마중물 역할과 정책 금융의 적극적 기여, 여기에 민간의 협조까지 더하게 됨으로써 한국판 뉴딜을 힘있게 추진할 물적 기반이 마련된 것입니다.
The president said he hopes that excess liquidity can be directed to more productive areas rather than unproductive ones such as the real estate market. Moon also promised to speed up regulatory reform to spur New Deal projects and related corporate activities. The president said this will be the largest investment in a single project to date. He stressed that active participation will be key for the success of the Korean New Deal, aimed at revitalizing the economy and preparing for the post-virus era. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, good afternoon. Thanks for coming on.
Good afternoon, Devin.
The latest Beige Book from the Federal Reserve shows U.S. economic activity recovering, but still well below where it was before the pandemic. How do you think this might affect future Fed policy?
U.S. Fed's Beige Book reports that U.S. economy grew modestly over summer, but remained well below its pre-pandemic level. It also points out that business situations are so different across regions and industries. The report emphasizes lots of problems, particularly in both of supplies and demand of labor market. Like under pandemic, employers still lay off workers, and for workers, it became harder to go back to work because of child care problems. So because of this very difficult and chaotic situation in U.S. Labor market, U.S. Fed will continue its expansionary monetary policy longer than expected.
Despite all that, U.S. stocks were strongly higher last night. New highs yet again for the NASDAQ and the S&P, seemingly on hopes for a vaccine. What's the story in the global markets?
Broad rally in U.S. Stocks lifted the Dow Jones Industrial, NASDAQ, and S&P 500 to new records. Stocks have soared from the collapse of in March with support from Fed's interest cuts and increasing hope for vaccine development in the near future. Dow Jones Industrial gained 1.6%, and NASDAQ also gained 1% on Wednesday.
And today on the Kospi as well, a lot of buying by foreign investors in particular. The index has performed about as well as U.S. stocks the day before. Tell us about the local markets.
Right. U.S. market's strong momentum yesterday is reflected in domestic market today. Particularly foreign investors, as you said, bought large amount of domestic stocks in KOSPI, which is the opposite trading compared to previous pattern. Finally, KOSPI had 1.3% return, and KOSDAQ has had a 0.9% return for today.
And we see oil prices down quite a bit now today with less demand from the U.S., lowest price in almost a month. Gold prices, though, still pretty close to their recent high. What's your outlook for oil and gold?
International oil price represented by Western Texas Intermediate dropped by 1.3% in a single day, down to $41.5 per barrel. As U.S. economy is slowly activating from shutdowns and lockdowns, there was decrease in gas demand from the United States. Since for months, global economy is recovering, and at the same time, there is still concerns on second pandemic. It is expected that both of oil price and gold price would be steady for months.
And Professor, zooming out a bit here, this week data show that if Korea's population continues to shrink like it has been doing, then 40 years from now, the country's debt will take up more than 80% of its GDP. What do you make of that estimate, and what can be done to shore up Korea's fiscal situation?
I would say that the real threat to Korean economy in the long run is population decrease rather than coronavirus pandemic of today. It affects all fundamentals of Korean economy like production, employment, government debt, and so on. According to recent government estimation, government debt will be increasing up to 81% of GDP until 2060 because number of economically active workers decreases fast. Then the government should be spending more money on supporting not working people like full-time retirees without increase of the tax revenues. So finally, government's fiscal health will be quickly worsened. So there, more careful fiscal expense management is strongly suggested, along with better planning on tackle low birth rate.
It is a major challenge, to be sure, Professor. Thanks so much for sharing your insights today. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
The South Korean company Kakao Games took deposits earlier this week from investors who want to buy shares when it debuts on the KOSPI next Thursday. And in that two-day period, it was oversubscribed by a factor of more than 1,500. To reserve just a single share, you needed a deposit of around $20,000, a sum that's out of reach for many small investors. So the government's considering a reform of the system. Ji-young has the details.
On Tuesday and Wednesday, Kakao Games drew nearly $50 billion in retail orders for its IPO, the most of any South Korean company to date. The offering was oversubscribed among retail investors by a multiple of about 1,525, which is more than 4 times the previous record set by SK Biopharmaceuticals.
The reason there was so much competition is because shares of Kakao Games were traded over the counter at more than 3 times the IPO price of 24,000 won.
Normally, to reserve shares, a retail investor only has to deposit half the amount of the shares they want to buy at the IPO price, which for Kakao Games was 24,000 won or about $20. But because it was oversubscribed by a factor of more than 1,500, to reserve a single share required a deposit of 24 million won or $20,000. That amount is far out of reach for small investors, so the Financial Services Commission is considering a reform of the IPO subscription system so the small investor can have a chance. Of those who are able to reserve shares in Kakao Games, their age skewed higher. According to Samsung Securities, which supplied 40% of the shares for retail investors, the biggest group of investors were in their 40s, followed by those in their 50s and then 30s. They also tended to buy in big. Those in their 70s bid the highest amount by average of $300,000 per person. The Kakao Games IPO has set high expectations for other upcoming offerings, including Big Hit Entertainment, the company behind BTS, which plans to raise about $810 million in its IPO. 엄지영, Arirang News.
In Major League Baseball, the Toronto Blue Jays' South Korean pitcher Ryu Hyun-jin has bagged his third win of the season on Wednesday. The left-hander struck out 8 batters and gave up just 1 run in 6 innings as his team went on to beat the Miami Marlins 2-1 at Marlins Park. His earned run average now stands at 2.72, good enough to be among the top 10 in the American League. And that does it for this newscast. Thank you for watching.